G'day everyone, it's Warren from NQ Explorers. Welcome to our latest Adventure Trek video. On this episode we're heading right up through the centre of Australia, through the desert country of the Outback, all the way from Adelaide to Darwin via the old Ghan railway line. Now this country was first explored in the 1860s by John McDowell Stuart, a Scotsman who's one of our greatest explorers. And John McDowell Stuart's routes that he opened up allowed both the overland telegraph line and the Central Australian Railway through this country. Now in the 1870s, this country, when the explorers came through, was lush and green. And so they reported back to the governor that this was suitable as pasture land. And there was a great land grab in this area in the late 19th century. Unfortunately, it's actually semi-arid desert country, and they were going through an unusually green period at the time. So they all got a false impression that this was wonderful pasture land. So a lot of sheep and pastoral stations were established, but later abandoned. So all up through this country, as you'll see in the next few days, along the railway line are the ruins of these old homesteads from the 19th century. And what we're going to do around these homesteads is do a bit of exploring and filming so you can see what it's like out in this country, and a bit of relic hunting and see if we can pick up some relics from the late 19th century. So what you see behind me now is an old culvert built in the 1870s as part of the original transcontinental line from the south to the north through Quorn and the Flinders Ranges onto Marree, out in the desert on the edge of the Simpson, and that's our next stop. Here we can see the railway heading north out of Marree into the desert to the north. This is one section of intact track that remains to this day. Okay, so now this is an old fettler's cottage that dates from the 1880s. It was built along the line to service the maintenance requirements. And because it's such a remote area, the fettlers had to live out here. They didn't go into town because there was no town. So I'm just going to search around the back of this old cottage, this old stoneware cottage that was built from local rock because there was no timber out here. And generally I'm hoping out the back they would have been recreating and maybe playing a bit of two-up. So let's go and see if we can find some relics out the back of the old fettler's cottage. Old 303. So the boys would have been probably shooting rabbits for a bit of tucker for the evening meal. Little tiny little pistol round there, tiny little thing. It's only a 68, but it's a compact and very sharp tone, as you can hear on the audio. So it's not a big piece of buried iron. It's gone. Could be another ammunition round, because they would have been all armed out here, that's for sure. Oh, here we go. Oh, it looks like it's maybe lead. It's not terribly heavy though. It might be a melted alloy from a campfire. So they lived out here for months on end, repairing the line. And the line had all sorts of issues, from sand drifts to floods, so it was a big job for the men that lived and worked out of this little hut here. And they're spread all along the line up towards Udnadatta, which is where we're heading now. So we'll have a bit of a detect around the old hut and see if there's anything left behind from the men. There's not necessarily any coins here because they wouldn't have had any need for money. But I'm sure there would have been a lot of shooting going on and all that sort of thing, because they had to find their own food. Some would have come on the train, but they would have hunted their own fresh meat. So we'll have a bit of a scratch around and see what turns up. Well, I've just found an interesting piece of railway history. It's an Australian Commonwealth halfpenny, dated 1915. It's been run over by a train. Some kids have been up to some hijinks back in the early 1900s and placed their halfpenny on the line. It's been squashed, the details mostly gone, and it's rail shaped. So there you go, bit of railway history on the Ghan line. Okay, so now you can see the old Ghan formation. Runs that way to Marree to the south and north to Alice Springs. And it follows the track that the camels pioneered back in the 1870s. Now, why was this the area that they chose to make a trade route? The reason is water. And the water comes from the Great Artesian Basin, well below the surface here, 2 kilometres. It's rain that fell in Queensland millions of years ago, and it comes up through these bubbler springs in South Australia. Now, you had to have the water for the men and the camels, and that's why the railway followed this route, because there was water all the way to Alice Springs. Okay, so this is a fairly standard design of a fettler's camp made of stone on the old Ghan line. Pretty comfortable place to come home to when you imagine it, because it's very remote and these blokes have been out working hard all day and they may not even come back each night because they have to go so far. Got the fireplace for the winter. Should be pretty hot in summer, but it's pretty comfortable. It's out of the wind. The desert wind is a real problem because you get so cold. But they've got 2 fireplaces. Probably have the ganger down the other end and the fettlers down in this end. Couple of rooms, very comfortable digs really. Be something pretty special after being out on the line for a few days camped under canvas. So yeah, this was home to these men for long periods of time. And even though the train did bring supplies, they had to be pretty self-sufficient, so they hunted their own meat, rabbits, roo, camel, whatever they could get. So to appreciate the isolation out here is difficult unless you have a look out the back window there, and you can see that there's absolutely nothing out there. Well, there's all sorts of theories about who named the Afghan Express the Ghan. What we can agree on is it was named after the Afghan cameleers who pioneered this trade route in the 1870s. Strings of hundreds of camels coming up out of Marree and Oodnadatta up to the north into Alice Springs. That was the only way to get through this country, and eventually the railway line followed. It didn't get to Alice Springs till 1929, and then it was replaced by the current standard gauge route in the 1980s. But can you imagine what it was like out here in 1870? Absolutely isolated, desolate. It is now, but we've got roads. No roads in those days. Well, I've just been detecting around that old fettler's quarters, as you saw, and I've just made an awesome find that directly connects me to these men that worked this line 140 years ago. It's an old brass button, our own make, in glorious condition, off a fettler's shirt or a pair of pants or suspenders or some such. And it's in great condition, preserved out here in this dry desert environment. reached here in the 1880s, and to cross the river they built the longest bridge ever made in South Australia, the Algie-Buckner Bridge, at over 500 metres, which you can see behind me here today. Righto, so we're well up the old Ghan line now, and behind me is an old homestead typical of this area. I've just had a bit of a scratch around here and found some interesting items that you would associate with this kind of area. Very remote, very lonely lifestyle for people out here. They'd have everything with them, completely self-sufficient. So entertainment, I've got an old harmonica reed, and there's obviously lots of ammunition. So you're going to get this kind of stuff in these sites. We've got shotguns, ammunition, and little bits of brassware off saddles and horse tack, that kind of thing. Very typical of what you find in the outback in these remote spots. Right, well, I'm still on the old homestead site. Between the railway line and the homestead, it was clearly a place to build a house because you had access to the freight on the line. I just got quite a nice find here. It was a high 60s signal. It's brass, and it's obviously a bit of a buckle of an old horse bridle or saddle equipment. Maybe even camel related, because there weren't many horses out here, it was mainly camels. Camels obviously suited to this arid environment, and they could get through the sandhills with their big soft feet, so they were extensively used. And to this day, there's many, many wild camel herds out in this country. Well, we've now reached Outback. This is the old railway station, now a museum, fittingly. The line reached here in the 1880s and was the head of the line until 1929, when it was completed to Alice Springs. So a lot of activity in this railway yard from the 1880s right up till the 1920s, because the camel teams continued north from here until the railway followed them. So Outback, a very historic spot on the old Ghan railway line. Well, I was just up there exploring the remnants of the old railway station, took the shortcut back to the truck, and to my surprise, look what I found. It's a World War II Bren carrier. Must have been brought out to Outback as a farm truck or something. Tracks are all gone, but you can see where the idler wheel's been there. Got the armour plate on the front in the driver's position. That's amazing. We've still got the rubber tied idler wheel on the right hand side, because the Australian Army used thousands of these things all through the Pacific and North Africa. An old Bren carrier. That's just amazing. Did not expect to see that out here. Look at that. Fantastic bit of history there. So here we are in Alice Springs. The narrow gauge Ghan arrived here in 1929, and at last this outback town had a reliable transport link to the southern states. 1980, the line was replaced by a new line further west on the standard gauge, and that line was eventually completed right through to Darwin in 2001, thus finally realising the transcontinental railway dream from the south to the north. The significance of the old Ghan railway can't be underestimated in Australian history. It allowed the centre of Australia to be opened up with a reliable transport system. When I say reliable, the old Ghan arrived sometimes 3 weeks late, but it was going to arrive. And there was an enormous amount of people involved in just the infrastructure of keeping the track open. So we've travelled up the full length of the old narrow gauge Ghan from Port Augusta all the way to Alice Springs. Now let's go and have a look at the new Ghan on the standard gauge from Alice Springs all the way to Darwin. New Ghan completes the journey from Adelaide to Darwin in 3 days, with leisurely stops along the way for passengers to explore Alice Springs, Ayers Rock and Catherine Gorge. Its luxury accommodation and 5-star restaurants are a far cry from conditions endured on the old Ghan. When the line was completed through to Darwin in 2004, all the mainland capital cities of Australia were finally connected to a standard gauge railway network. Well, here we are now in Darwin, in the Northern Territory, on the Arafura Sea. We've crossed Australia from south to north, up the old Ghan railway line, where those wonderful historic relics still exist, and then on the new Ghan into Darwin from Alice Springs. Of course, the new Ghan is a very different beast to the original Ghan in both purpose and nature. The old Ghan was a essential outback link for people of the inland for supplies and basic transport. New Ghan's a tourist venture, but it continues that name, the Ghan, which started way back in the 1850s with the cameleers that opened up the outback. I hope you enjoyed that adventure trek. Bye for now.